What a treat we have in store for you tonight, the third of a series of Big Ideas webinars. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Kecia Hayes, one of our AU SOE faculty and a champion of anti-racist K-12 leadership and praxis in New York City, where she brings a wealth of experiences and collaborations around school improvement, community school initiatives, and builds networks around school reform and change. Dr. Hayes will set the table this evening in conversation with our guest, Professor Sophia Rodriguez, Urban Ed Professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, on the topic of school violence and safety, based on her work on belonging, especially among youth of color and in their lived realities of anti-Black racism and racial injustice. Dr. Hayes.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it, Dr. Hopson. And Dr. Rodriguez, welcome, and thank you so much for taking time to spend with us this evening. I thought we'd get started by hearing a little bit more about your research. And just to kick it off, one of the things that really stood out to me was this idea of not only does your research sort of expand our conceptualization of violence, right? It's not just the physicality of it, but it's also elements that relate to social isolation, right? That sense of belonging. And if we were to think about it in terms of an ecosystem of connectedness, right? How do we begin to think about all of the ways in which there's stress and strain on that, right? That it's really getting disrupted and eroded. And even if we were to consider that families are a part of that, and we have researchers coming out of the public health field that talk about how social engagement in families has been progressively declining, in part because of new issues with respect to work and work hours. How do you begin to think about all of those pieces that fit together in that ecosystem and all of the spaces where you find erosion, where you find that kids are not getting that well-netted support system that they actually need?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I always start with kids. So I always try to center their voice and their experience. That's sort of been the theme in my work over the past decade or so. Even when it's hard, I think adults are very often busy and intent on sort of thinking they know what's going on. But when you actually talk to kids, and I've had the very amazing privilege of talking to a lot of kids over the years in multiple cities and urban districts in the US, and I think they know they're the author of their experience, and they sort of can tell you really straightforwardly, as you know, in your own experience, what's actually going on. So I think to your point about the ecosystem, so actually I have a paper coming out with some of my students where we've talked about this ecosystem of care that we're calling it. And so for us, I'm really interested in the community, family, school, youth relationships. And I think it's difficult because a lot of the kids that I have studied over the years and worked with, they experience sort of isolation on multiple levels, right? So either they're carrying a lot and brokering a lot of knowledge and awareness about the school and the way it works with their parents or families. So they're kind of carrying that. And often then parents are not necessarily welcomed into the school climate either. And so I've done a lot of work around families and parents' experiences as well, specifically Black and Latinx parents, and hearing their experiences of exclusion and in many cases discrimination, just feeling racially excluded, or in immigrant parents' experiences, I hear a lot around feeling discriminated against because of their language barrier. And so I think having those layers where the parents are feeling excluded, then the kids kind of take that on sometimes. And so I'm really interested in what relationships schools and potentially districts have that can either on an individual level, like through a school counselor or a school social worker, broker or bridge those relationships, or more systemically and structurally through, I know you do work on community schools, so community school partnerships. I do a lot of work in and with community-based organizations that have a strong presence in schools. So that's all for me part of the ecosystem, and part of those partnerships, especially because kids are often turning to different places for support. Within the school, I think it can be more challenging because really these things have to come from the systems level, whether that's at the school level through the leaders or at the district level through that leadership. So I think there's multiple ways to get at it. But if we're not sort of thinking at the systems level, I'm not really sure that we'll see transformation. So those are some of the thoughts I have on that.
That's great. Thank you for that. Very full of a lot of interesting ideas there. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking through this is that it seems as though we have spent a lot of time in creating policy and practices that get us to thin equity, right? It's the low-hanging fruit. And sometimes when we talk about the representation of it all, that gets us there. And it keeps us from actually peering into that more structural piece that you're talking about, or what I would consider thick equity work. And so I'm wondering, as you think about this, what does it take to move the field of educators, not just to be practitioners working towards representational inclusion and working towards the thin equity, but moving educators across the field, right? Teachers, leaders, and the whole lot of us, moving us to an advocacy for the structural transformations to create the systems that you're actually envisioning and describing. Because without that, representation will only take us so far. So I'm wondering, what is it that we need to do in the field?
Yeah, another big, great question. So I think one of the things I've been working on a lot in my research is through partnerships with school districts. And this has been challenging for me, only because I've spent so much time working with kids, and then you realize that the decision makers are the one that are going to be the ones, actually shifting things. So I think, there's a hot buzzword, research practice partnerships in our field. I don't use that term, but that's sort of what I do. And I think that work has been really promising. Other folks like Dr. Terrence Green, who's at UT Austin, and Dakota Irby at University of Illinois, Chicago, and Ann Ishimaru at Washington, they've been sort of really challenging the way we think about collaboration and transformation in schools. So I've kind of been following a little bit of their lead in that regard. So I think at the school level or the district level, a place that I've seen that potential for shifting to thick equity, I like that phrase, is through racial equity plans. And so one of my partners right now is working through, it takes time and it can be frustrating just because it's slow moving work, but I think actually building in specific outcomes that they want to see into their racial equity plan. And so we just had a partner, kind of a big win. Their board passed the equity plan. And so we're collecting data around student or youth belonging as well as teacher belonging to see kind of where the misalignment is, because I think often we sort of collect data for data's sake or research for research sake. And then it's never used, right? So people are like, oh yeah, we're data driven, and we do a survey and then we never look at it. So I'm kind of the annoying person that's like, okay, how are we looking at this? What are we doing? Where is it lining up? But I think our work as researchers can be really valuable in district level partnerships in that way, because we do usually have the time and the skills to sort of provide them with useful information that might inform their practices or their programming or their plans. So that's how I'm seeing an opportunity. And I think other folks through these equity audits, I know there's been a lot of work coming out the past couple of years on that. But I think it's slow moving, right? And there's not necessarily an incentive for districts. And so that's, and then, you get into the academic side. What's the incentive of doing community engaged work? So there's a lot of barriers to that, but I also think it's a huge opportunity and place to locate our potential.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, one of the things I often think about, if we are talking about changing practice, we have to link that to accountability, right? There has to be a reciprocity there. And so it's really difficult for us to say, I'm going to get my educators in the school building or even in a community-based organization doing out of school time work to actually make the kinds of shifts to create culturally sustaining, not just responsive pedagogy, curricula, to actually create learning environments that are trauma informed. If we don't say, if you don't do this, there will be a consequence. And so I think that gets really difficult. But I'm also wondering about, is there a need for us to change the discourse? So one of the things I often think about when I go into schools and I hear the educators talking about how bad chronic absenteeism is. And a few times, particularly at the high school level, I have said to school leaders, do you understand your chronic absenteeism as a function of student dissatisfaction? Right? When students don't have any other mechanism to give voice to how they feel oppressed in this space, absence is a way that they can do that. And so I'm wondering, do you think that there's also a need to leverage student voice to help us reframe how we have thought about some of these concepts and circumstances and dynamics that we have labeled in a very adult favored way, right? Chronic absenteeism, I have to fix a kid and fix a family, but it doesn't necessarily put any onus on me as the educator to change. So I'm wondering, how do you think about that aspect of it?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think there's such a deficit-based discourse around kids' experiences and their actions in schools. And then that burden gets shifted away from the structural component or the adults of changing practice to, and again, like I was a teacher, I was a high school teacher and a middle school teacher in New York City public schools, as well as in Chicago public schools. And I get it. Like it is the hardest job I ever had. There's no doubt. But then it's hard also because there's a tension between, I think, so I've also surveyed a lot of teachers in a couple of my projects. One study I looked at over 5,200 public school teachers and their kind of beliefs and views on immigrant students. That was a particular study. And then I'm currently doing a project around teacher belonging where we're surveying teachers to kind of understand their experience within the school and then to your point, their perceptions of student issues or student behavior. And one of the things is around absenteeism. And it's interesting to see their perceptions, right? So of course, they're entitled to their opinion as teachers, but there isn't necessarily a deeper understanding of what's going on with the kids in the schools. And so I think, yeah, if kids don't feel connected to school, why would they want to go? Why would they want to go to a place where they're adultified, disciplined, often unfairly, especially for Black and Latinx students? There's often a lack of representation, to your point, or it's superficial. You had a nice phrase for it, thin. I call it superficial equity work. But I think schools, on the one hand, are really powerful spaces and often spaces that low-income students, go to for resources or for that safe feeling or safe space or connectedness, but then they're not doing their part to create those environments. And so I think reframing and understanding through the leveraging of student voice is one way to do it. So that was sort of the impetus for my larger survey that I've done. I have over 3,800 kids now across 2 districts who've been all saying the same thing, that they're feeling a lack of connection at best, right? And at worst, they're experiencing racial incidents, and those things are not like being addressed by the school. And so, yeah, I think there needs to be a way of incorporating their experience, incorporating, the stories that they have to share, around a dialogue that it often will need to include adults, but I think the youth voice has to be centered because, again, they're the ones that are experiencing. And adults may not know that the things they're saying are deficit oriented. So we should be telling them that, if kids are experiencing that. So yeah, I definitely agree. Just around reframing what is actually happening from the kids' perspective could be really powerful.
That's great. Thank you for that. One of the things that, as you were talking about this and talking about all of the ways in which it becomes problematic, you know, the sort of isolation of kids, the marginalizing of them in what should be their space, right? School should be the space of youth. And so one of the things I wonder about, is there an intergenerational arc that we have to recognize with this, right? Because if I'm a young person today experiencing my space of school as something that's oppressive, that's isolating, that's not engaging, that criminalizes me, that does all of these things, right? And othering me, is this really going to be a space I want to engage in as a parent? And when we look across different communities, whether it's the Black community and we look at some of the collateral damage that came out of Brown, if we look at our Indigenous communities and we look at what happened with some of the boarding school experiences, or even the erasure kind of curricular approaches, where we're going to erase any idea that there was Indigenous communities in this country, I'm wondering, how do you place, or how do you deal with that intergenerational arc of the experiences that the young people you're working with have, because it does have implications as they journey into adulthood?
Yeah, I think this is really tough. And so I've been very fortunate in the DMV area. I work with a couple community-based organizations who actually are trying to address this intergenerational component, which prior to the past year and a half or so, I hadn't really done a lot of work with parents or families or caregivers. So again, it's outside of the school space, or it's really being driven by the community-based organization in both cases, the two groups I work with. And so the way that they're trying, there's some ideas that have come out of it. And so we're actually evaluating one of the programs. So this community-based organization has developed a parent and a youth program. And so they're being run like parallel, but they're completely, it's like a living curriculum. So we developed the curriculum very loosely, but really the parents have come together. And in many cases, it was just mothers for this particular program. Not because we didn't want a diverse group or fathers, it was just more complicated than that, which I'm happy to share more about. But for now, I'll just say that. And I think the mothers found that space to be really a space of solidarity, and also a space that they could feel safe. So the program meets weekly, and it started in the community-based space on Zoom during the pandemic, and then has grown and flourished where they meet on their own. And then some of the community-based staff will sit in on the program meetings with them, but really they wanted to just give them a space to talk about issues as parents, as mothers. And then we were like, wow, this is really working. We're seeing a lot of not just sort of good, strong relationships formed, but some sense of advocacy and agency. And so that was sort of one of the outcomes for that program for the parents. And then we were like, what if we did this with the youth? So this year we're piloting the youth program in 2 high schools in the DMV area. And similarly, the youth are sort of generating. So the topics are things like coping with stress, anxiety, mental health. How do you deal with sort of like challenging incidents or racism that you've experienced in school, things like that. Unfortunately, it's not a school-wide program, so we are only serving like 10 kids in the group, and I think 12 to 14 parents. So, but these are little ideas that schools could implement to address some of those issues. And our hope with this project is to then bring the kind of dyads or the youth families together. And the other organization, they're developing a similar program, but again, it's community driven. So they are partnered with multiple high schools, but because of the lack of kind of formal partnership with the school district, there isn't an opportunity to capitalize on this. But I think from our purposes, or for our purposes in the research, we're trying to pilot these ideas to make the case that they work. And then the hope is to then advocate with the school districts. But I think those are ways to start to address that and to start to bring parents into the conversation, into the fold. Because to our earlier kind of points we were making, many of these parents, again, either have experienced like actual racism, anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, false narratives about who they are and their experience. So why would they want to go talk to the people at school? So we're trying to sort of help build like capital and confidence and agency, but then also within the group dynamic, a sense of solidarity among multiple parents as well. So again, we're still in the early stages of that project, but I think there's a lot of potential. And really, honestly, it should be coming from the school. Like this should be part of family engagement practice. That's why those people exist in districts, yet they remain pretty community driven, at least in, my experience.
That's a really great point. I don't know if we have gotten past the idea that family engagement, as it's thought about and practiced now, really benefits the school, but we may need to think about family engagement from a more activist stance, because that begins to change the dynamic of how we see that engagement actually yielding benefits to address some of the conditions that you're talking about. And so along that line, I'm wondering about two things. One, in the work that I've done, it seems that young people are creating spaces where they can build their own ecosystem of care, right? They're recognizing that I am not getting what I need from these other spaces, whether it's community out of school that you've identified, whether it's a school space, whatever it might be, I'm not getting it. So I'm going to create that. And in some instances, they're creating that in an activist stance, right? I think about Californians for Justice, right? And they do a lot of work around this notion of relationship centeredness, right? We also have Youth Together that's really thinking about building multiracial leadership through mobilizing young people for activist work. And so is that space of social movements and activism a space that young people have said we're going to claim as our own to not only advance what we care about in ways that we care about, particularly intersectionality in dealing with oppression, but also we're going to create spaces that allow us to be connected because we're not finding that elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've kind of seen the gamut of this in my research. So about a decade ago, I studied an immigrants' rights organization in Chicago that was a community school, a full service community school. And so in that situation, it was awesome because there was a direct advocacy activist lens to the CBO, the community-based organizations work with the youth. They had after-school programming that was specifically about like youth development, youth leadership. In other community-based organizations that I've seen, it kind of can vary. So it kind of depends on where the kids like enter into, but most of the ones I've studied have had some sort of youth development, civic engagement, youth leadership component. And I think to address your kind of 2 points, one, I do think it's really powerful because kids, because their identities, now I'm talking about minoritized youth here, because they're often rejected from school, they feel, Ana Valenzuela has called it that subtractive school experience. Others have named it the push out experience. I think they're facing that institutional rejection. I'm hearing in my research with hundreds of kids that they don't feel valued in school, they don't feel heard, their identities aren't affirmed, but then they go to these after school spaces and suddenly they kind of come alive, right? Their voices are heard. Often in the organizations that I study, kids' input is incorporated into the curriculum. So they might have a sort of general topic that they might be studying, but kids are really kind of bringing their own ideas and taking ownership over what they're learning and doing. And then I think when they do the activist component, it just gives them a greater sense, kind of like what am I trying to say? Like a bigger, like there's a bigger thing happening. And I think that sort of activist component can really support youth leadership, youth empowerment. One organization in DC that a colleague of mine had been working on, and now she's really spearheading, is the Black Swan Academy. I think they are an amazing model for youth activism and police-free schools. They really had a lot of success with their campaigns. Some of the other organizations that I work with, the kids are kind of entering into what type of advocacy campaign they want to work on this year. So I think those things will be coming out. But I do think it's really powerful. And again, I don't know why they're not doing this stuff in school too, but that is what keeps us in business, I guess, to study these things. But yeah, I definitely find that the activist component can really help. And even with the parents, I do a lot of work with this one organization that is really the broker between the families and the school district. And they're always sort of like, what kind of data do we need to support families and to empower them and equip them to go to school board meetings, to speak out? So I think those activist components at the parent level can be really powerful. The last thing I'll say is, a lot of my work has been with newly arrived immigrants, youth and families. And I think, you can build toward that activism, but some of their experiences, we're talking about trauma here, or experiences of exclusion or just navigating a new society. I think the arc of that is just a little bit longer because they're sort of trying to figure out what their agency is, and what it could be. But nonetheless, I do think all of that is very critical to sense of belonging, sense of strong identity, and nurturing that beyond just themselves, but for their broader community of family and other community members.
I think that's a really important point, because one of the things as you were talking through that, it made me think about for some of the Black and Latino youth in particular, and I would even add some of the Indigenous youth in particular, they're pulling on culturally sustaining elements from their own cultures when they engage in this activism, right? Activism has been core to their cultural communities. So to actually engage in that is a piece of this idea, I'm reconnecting with who I am, right? Which was some of the things that your students in some of your studies have said, right? This curriculum is not necessarily helping me to understand who I am, right? I don't have a cultural connection here. And some of the activism work can do that because of the historical understanding of what their communities engaged in. And when we start talking about immigrant youth, one of the things I think is really interesting is that a lot of young people in their activist work today are thinking about intersectionalities, right? So they don't see themselves as having one particular identity, cultural identity. And so they really want to think about that. And I wonder if that creates spaces for immigrant youth. I also wonder if the work that some youth are doing creates a foundation for immigrant youth to sort of say, we're going to step into that, right? There's a staircase, there's a pathway that has been dug out for us because of these other young people doing the activist work. And then how do we begin to connect adult activism where you can vote, where you can do other things within civil society that has the power to create the kind of structural change we were talking about earlier? How do we connect that to what the young people are doing so it becomes an extension that moves us closer to the kind of change you're talking about in hopefully a quicker way, because this can go on forever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, there's so many organizations. I work with a collaborative across the country of 16 community-based organizations. They're all focused on immigrant and refugee families and youth. But I mean, I think in the DC area alone, there's several working on issues related to, school police and police-free schools, abolitionist teaching. I think they're already doing the work. I think if we're privileged enough as researchers to engage with them, that's awesome, but they're out there. It's not like we need to create something. I think we just need to, you are, I'm sure, familiar with Tara Yasso's work, like their cultural or community cultural wealth, like their own forms of capital exist. We, as the institution of school, we just don't acknowledge that. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely something that we need to acknowledge and think about. But I think in terms of how do we build, within the youth and then across the to the parents and the larger communities. You know, I think some organizations are doing that, and the work that I'm seeing, it's definitely slow because of some of the issues, again, with the immigrant community that I work with in one of the organizations, just because they're newly arrived and there's a lot of barriers, there's a lot of trauma, there's other things going on. So like political activism is sort of over here on the continuum of like everyday survival and direct service, right? So I think we have to kind of meet people where they're at as well. But in terms of the kids, because they're going to school, because they're engaging in society and civic institutions often more rapidly than their parents, I think there's a greater opportunity there. But I think to your other question around, you know, how do we actually do that? Again, I don't know that like the school needs to write a plan or a handbook on that. I think communities are doing it. It's just a matter of sort of acknowledging that and treating that as capital, right? Treating that as sort of, I've talked about it as like subjugated knowledge or embodied knowledge that these communities already have and bring. We're just not acknowledging it and tapping into it.
And maybe that's something we do need to hold schools accountable for, right? How do you create spaces for that to flourish? Not just to say, I hear you and I value you, but I'm actually going to create space for that to flourish. We're going to open it out for questions, but I just wanted to have, I have one final question I wanted to get your insights on. So one of the things I often think about when I think about educational change in this country, activism played a huge role. Understanding the research and how do we move into a space from theory to practice, right? What's the praxis of it? But the other really critical space has been the courts. And we know Brown has been incredibly instrumental in terms of moving us into a space of desegregation, although we are now in a very resegregated space. But it's been helpful in making that leap, right? And changing some understandings of what it means to move towards equality. And one of the things I wonder about, is it time for us to have some additional evolutions on the legal arguments that we are making when we begin to challenge what's happening, policy and practice and legislation in our schools, such that we're actually saying we have to pay attention to matters of lack of sense of belonging. We have to pay attention to social isolation. And so funding formulas should be connected to how do you begin to mitigate that, because it has this highly detrimental impact. You're talking about it in an educational sense, but if we were to go to public health officials, they would talk about it from a health stance, right? So I'm wondering, is it time for us to think about what's that next evolution of the legal argument in order to help move the needle on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to adultify and criminalize young people, then there should also be the opportunity to have sort of a rebuttal, right? So yeah, I definitely agree with that. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, like in terms of legal arguments, but I think I see a lot of both from researchers as well as community members, they're engaging in activism for the purpose of pushing legislation, or at least, you know, in Maryland, I've worked with the Latino caucus a little bit, and they are sort of very interested in young people's experiences as well as research to use it for the purpose of agenda setting. Many of my colleagues at Maryland are very active and involved in the legislative agenda around multilingual learners, especially more recently. So I know that there's opportunities to inform and influence the legislative component. So I can't see why not considering the other legal component. I guess the only other thing I would say related to that is, you know, in many cases, I've been in districts where parents and teachers have like secretly reported civil rights violations and things like that, but they're often, it's like a contentious thing because educators are a little more limited often in that work. But yeah, I think at the legal level, certainly we need to consider what are the structures that are actually kind of informing kids' experiences, and maybe if kids are choosing to, you know, not be in school or not engage in school in the way that the school system wants them to, like, why not challenge that system rather than place that burden on the kid? I think that is sort of the takeaway for me.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. So we do have some audience questions, so we're really excited about that. So one question, one of our participants has said, my school speaks 46 languages and have lived in 22 countries. There's a really diverse student body at this school. And one of the things that the participant wonders about is this idea of spotlighting certain communities, say for a special month, and how that can cause issues and concerns as others can feel left out.
Oops. Yeah, that's a really tough dynamic. I'm actually, one of the districts I'm working with is similarly diverse, beyond sort of measure, you know, I think. And especially when you kind of, it can actually happen when you're talking about Black and Latinx students. I face this a lot in my own work, just because I have focused a lot on the Latinx community. But, you know, I think just because we support one group doesn't mean we don't support other groups. And so I think, but having that be kind of clear, you know, with 46, I think you said languages, you know, that's 46 days right there out of the school year. So I think we have to have a conversation. And I think one thing that schools don't always do is it feels a little superficial. I know kids have talked a lot about that, having like culture day at their school. But all of these things, I don't know, for me, I don't think they would be so problematic if they weren't, if they were integrated, right? So when we talk about, you mentioned already some of the culturally sustaining practices, that's not like have one day where we celebrate X culture. It's more about integrating things. So it's celebrated in some way every day, whether that's through the curriculum, whether that's through the books they're reading, you know, the films they're watching and analyzing, or the topics, you know, that come up in various classes. And I think just being explicit about that, I hear a lot in my research, kids feeling like their own cultures and races and ethnicities are not valued, that beliefs about them are not positive. So depending again on what's happening in that school or in that district, there might be different starting points, but I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with spotlighting if there's a conversation about why we're doing it as a school community. And is that something that the community thinks would be useful? You know, I don't know that we've asked people in communities if that's something that's useful, but I do think explicit conversations around culture, race, ethnicity, because kids are talking about it and they know about it. I think it's the adults that are more nervous about talking about that stuff. But thank you for and comment.
Yeah, and it almost seems as though it's not so much the spotlight that's the issue, but the extent to which that spotlight makes me a fetish, right? And it's like, we're going to learn about my culture because you're going to fetishize me, instead of saying, how do I begin to understand your culture as an integral part of American culture, right? And what we are talking about curricularly or programmatically. So that's fantastic. Another question, IDEA interpretation. This participant says that it has allowed many more violent kids into the elementary school where the participant works, which can be very traumatic to young classmates. Do you have any insights into how to deal with young violent students?
Without having context, that's a really tough question. So Kecia, I welcome your support on this one too. I'm less familiar. I mean, I know what IDEA is and I know sort of the general parameters, but generally if there are supports in that school, whether it's through a counselor or a social worker, you know, ideally there should be some sort of plan in place for that student, and the support team, especially if they have an IEP. I'm not sure, again, what the context is, and so I'm not comfortable speaking kind of beyond that, but I think generally there should be a plan in place if kids are coming in with issues that are documented at the very least. They have an entitlement to services and they have a right to go to school. So that school environment needs to support that student and potentially that family as well. I don't know if Kecia, you want to add anything?
No, I was just actually going back to something you had said earlier that, right, the whole notion of the community school strategy becomes a space where we can think about this differently because, as you said, we have to think about the fact that all children are entitled to an education. The question becomes, do we have the resources and services in play to support that child and that family? And that would sort of be my first inclination. The other inclination I would have is to wonder about what are we doing programmatically and curricularly, right? One of the things I don't think we think enough about is what's the arc of moving kids into a prison, school to prison pipeline, right? It's not just I start misbehaving and it escalates to we're moving you into this pipeline. There are a whole bunch of different triggers that happen, and it begins with some of the disengagement. So I would wonder about what's happening from an instructional and curricular perspective, as well as this is the behavior of the child, right? I think it has to have a comprehensive look. That would be my thinking. Yeah. Other questions? I'm wondering, while we're waiting for some other questions to come in, because of all of the national talk lately of TikTok, I am wondering, where do you see social media's role in all of this?
Is that for me? Sorry.
That's for you, my friend.
So I think it's really powerful. So especially kind of like during the pandemic, there's been a number of research studies that have come out about kids' use of social media for the purpose of like literacy development. But I think in terms of social movement, some of the activist things we were talking about earlier, in the after school program, there's a number of like projects that kids are doing digitally. So they're creating reels, they're creating Instagram messages, TikToks as part of their learning about the community and the issues that their communities are facing. So I think that's the positive potential of it. I think it allows access. You know, the downside is you need sort of a phone and internet, and many of the families that I work with, you know, they're low income or they live in pretty dire poverty conditions and they might not have consistent access to technology. But, you know, there's obviously drawbacks of over relying on that. But I do think from the kids' perspective, it can be really powerful to engage with issues and put issues out there. So I'll give you one example. I'm working right now with a community-based organization in the DMV area, and some of the youth in one of the high schools, they're helping. So I've done all this research, collected survey data and focus group data of parents. And then the organization's like, we want to present this to school board, you know, write a letter to the editor, do all this stuff. And so I created a boring PowerPoint and like a one pager. And they were like, this is so boring. Here's a high school student to help you make this interesting. So it's been really fun for me. It's sort of a more YPAR kind of study, but so I've been working with the high school youth to create social media reels to get the message to the district and to the local community about some of the issues that the parents were facing. So we've been working on that. So in terms of like activism, I think it can be really powerful. You know, again, I think the access issue might be present as well, but that's sort of something I've seen because kids are reading that stuff, they're using those platforms. And so it's kind of on us adults and old farts to get on board with that. And I think to see how it can be a source of empowerment for them as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We'll have to make sure our senators hear about that. That's a really important piece. Another question related to the technology piece of things. The participant asked if you could elaborate on your perspective on AI-assisted violence detection and the possibility of using it in a school environment.
I am not familiar with that, so I'm actually probably not the best person to comment. I'm not entirely certain what it looks like. Are they asking because it's in their school or potentially the school wants to use something like this?
It's unclear. So if the person wants to clarify on that, and then we'll come back to circle back to that. Another question is, given the importance of youth voice and leadership that you highlight in your research, what are some effective ways schools can incorporate student perspectives and experiences into curriculum development, policy, everyday practices to really combat the sense of alienation that students are feeling?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. I think that's something that I've spent a lot of time walking alongside young people and thinking about. So I think it can definitely happen. And I think with curriculum development, something that can be really interesting is incorporating student experiences, student voices. I know when I was a teacher, I did that. We might have sort of objectives or outcomes or standards we have to meet, but often, particularly in some of the humanities, maybe ELA or social studies, it might be a little easier to incorporate that into curriculum for sure. But I think there's definitely room to have sort of community commitments and community topics that kids want to address. I've done that a lot in my research with kids on some of the belonging stuff I've done. And I'm happy to share those publications and resources that we've developed with kids around the curriculum. I think school policy and everyday practices to combat isolation. Yeah, I think again, it goes back to kind of what I was talking about. There seems to be kind of teachers and leaders' perspectives on things and kids' perspectives on things. And you need somebody to kind of broker that and say like, hey, here's what we're missing from both sides. I know some school districts, one of my colleagues at Boston College, she's been working with a district who's developed a youth cabinet. So there's a set of youth who get invited to the school board meetings, all of them, not just the public ones, but the ones where real decisions are made behind closed doors. So I definitely think there's opportunities to incorporate and invite students into those conversations. That's one thing. And then there is a second question here, I think, too.
Yeah, and that's pushing on this idea of family engagement. So have you seen innovative approaches that schools are taking to really foster better family engagement, especially in the context where there's historical marginalization and distrust?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mentioned a couple folks earlier. Anne Ishimaru, who is at the University of Washington, she developed an entire sort of co-design network of schools and families that sort of takes this approach of equitable collaboration, which is, not just inviting parents to come to conferences or not just calling them when something bad happens, but actually sort of engaged in the work of the school. So she would be a great person to check out. And then I think I'm happy to share some of the work that I've done around this issue. I just mentioned the one with the high school student I'm working with. That's actually a parent engagement study, and we're working with a community-based organization. And I'm doing the research for them, but what I'm trying to do is kind of listen to the community and what they need. And this organization has a strong network of families. They work with over 300 Latinx immigrant families. And so they see certain issues, and then I help provide data and research, and then they sort of develop with the parents an advocacy campaign to the school district. So I don't know that that's innovative, but I think it's a really great approach, and we don't do it often because of these traditional ways we view community engagement. I hear a lot like school districts will say, oh, I sent out a survey or I sent home this information. And it's like, well, who cares, right? Do you think working families have time to fill out a survey? And if they do, that's awesome. But what are you doing with that information? Have you asked if that's the best way that they receive information? So I think, again, coming back to like how schools are actually doing that engagement and what that means is not often aligned with how parents want that to be or understand it to be. So I think having those conversations has been really helpful in our work, and I know in the work that Anna Shimaro has done. But I'm happy to share kind of links or resources if that's helpful, because there's definitely.
That's great.
Yeah, no.
No, that's great. Thank you. Another question is around this idea of phones, right? So phones are seen as a bit of a coping mechanism, right? I'm not feeling connected or engaged in this space. Let me pull out my phone where I can be distracted. And so the participant would love to hear your thoughts on banning phones in schools and any research that you know of that really speaks to this idea of sort of using technology as a coping mechanism to get out of a space where you don't feel engaged or connected.
I feel like I do that. Yeah, so I don't know, I think it's a challenge. You know, when I was a teacher, we didn't like this was a decade ago, so phones weren't as big of a thing. It was more the like iPod back then. Um, I think now it's a tough battle. So I'm an ethnographer by training, so I spend a lot of time in spaces that I study, schools and after school spaces or out of school spaces. And I think the phone battle is, it is a battle. It is ongoing. You know, I think it depends on the context. You know, if kids are constantly on their phones, I think that that's an engagement issue, obviously. And Kecia, you raised this earlier, thinking about why kids aren't engaged. You know, maybe they're doing things that are disconnected from their experience or who they am in school. And so, you know, I think if they're on their phone, that's another outlet for them. I don't necessarily think that's bad. I think using it to an advantage can be really helpful in the after school space. But yeah, I've also seen the other thing where a teacher will make kids put their phone in a box when they walk in the room. I personally think you're asking for trouble with that approach. I think the punitive approach isn't always as useful, but yeah, I think there has to be a conversation around why are we on our phone all the time? And as adults, we're guilty of this too. I've seen teachers in the room on their phone while kids are, you know, doing work. So I don't know that it's always a kid issue only, as well.
Yeah, I think it's often not a kid issue. We're asking them to stop doing the very behavior we keep modeling. So
Yeah.
that seems a little bizarre.
Yeah.
There was a comment about the need for working with children who have had traumatic journeys to the US.
Yeah.
And this has become increasingly an important issue in New York City,
Mhm.
right? Because we have had an influx of young people who have crossed the border. And not only has that been traumatic, but the journey to New York City from places like Texas has been really traumatic. And
Yeah.
so the participant is wondering, have you seen any really good solutions that schools are implementing that are really helping families and students deal with the trauma of this all? Not all school has counselors, not all schools have social workers, but
Right.
are there some innovative and really meaningful interventions that are happening at schools to deal with this kind of trauma?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I think that there's sort of a whole body of work that's come out in the last 5 years or so around trauma-informed schooling. And I think there are tools that, and again, I'm happy to share links to all this. So there's tools for leaders and for schools. I've actually examined two different tools around trauma work, and I think there's benefits and drawbacks to both, but I'm happy to share those particular tools. They really function like a checklist for schools to kind of think about and use. Um, there hasn't been any like research on whether or not they work. But they are out there, and that was developed. In my own work, I mentioned this earlier, so we've been piloting an intervention around migration related trauma with young people in 2 high schools. And so again, that study isn't finished yet, but I'm happy to share it when it is. But I think the practices that we've been engaging in, so there's a whole team of people that are working on the intervention. So it's not just about the researchers, it's actually there's school support staff. So there is one school counselor in one of the high schools that's been kind of one of the leads on it. And then there have been some other mental health support staff that have been hired through a community school partnership that have enabled the work to get done in the school. So it typically happens during the lunch hour or an advisory where kids are talking about some of these issues. Now, kids self-select into the conversation because again, we're talking about migration. These are really sensitive issues. And even though kids have a right to go to school regardless of their immigration status, from Plyler v. Doe, they don't have to disclose their status issues. And so a lot of that trauma can get compounded because they're not sharing their experience. And so I think schools have to be really cautious about how they engage the trauma conversation, especially around migrant youth. And so in our case, we are fortunate that we have, a partnership with staff that are pretty familiar with the community, and they happen to be at high schools that are high percentage immigrant serving. So, even though people don't ask about immigration status, there's that experience often comes up, whether it's to the teacher or to another staff person. And again, kids self-select into this particular program. But those interventions aren't like, hey, are you a migrant who's experienced trauma? It's more like, here's some conversation points that we want to talk about. We want to create a space for you to have dialogue around issues of isolation or anxiety or fears. And so it's sort of couched more generally, and then within the conversation, some of those issues related to migration and trauma come out. That's been our approach, so that it's really driven by the community members, by the youth, so that we're not like putting a sign on people's head to kind of share, about their trauma. But again, there's very few interventions like that, which is why we've sort of have launched this project. But again, I'm happy to talk more if that person wants to reach out. I think you can give them my email and I can share more about the content of the program as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and I so appreciate you and your research for really expanding our thinking around what is violent, right? And how is that actually experienced, not just conceptualized, and how our young people are experiencing it and coping with it each and every day. So thank you so much for all that you're doing. It's making a tremendous impact. So I will turn it over to Dr. Hopson, who will conclude for us. Thank you.
I don't actually want it to conclude, but thank you so much, both of you, Sophia and Kecia, for raising some critical questions about what it means to center youth voices and lived experiences as authors, as agents in building social and cultural capital. I mean, just this lifting up the notions of ecosystems of care around youth, the family, and school relationships. So thank you again. I wanted to, in the way of sort of next steps, you've promised some things to us, and so we're going to bug you both about those resources that you shared with us. So be ready for that. I think typically what we do is after each webinar, we make not only our webinar available on our website, but we also include resources that have been noted in the webinar, and so that'd be a great shout out as well. 2, we encourage all those participants to tune into our next and upcoming Big Ideas webinars in terms of thinking about the challenges and recognition of the legacies of Brown and the Civil Rights Act of '64. And also, especially, stay tuned for our annual Siege Conference. I have a note here that I want to make sure I highlight from our director, who sent it to me just a little while ago. And this year's Summer Institute on Education, Equity, and Justice Conference is scheduled for Monday, June 24th through 26th. The Edmund Gordon Distinguished Lecture on Wednesday, June 26th, with Dr. Bettina Love, TC, Teachers College, Columbia University. Our own here, Dr. Sophia Rodriguez, will deliver our opening keynote on Monday, June 24th. We're looking forward to that, Sophia. And then, of course, those 3-day conference activities include virtual, hybridity, and a host of panels and speakers. Registration will open next month, April 10th. Again, thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Kecia. Thank you all for attending our Big Ideas webinar, and have a great evening.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for your questions, Kecia, and to the
absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for the support online too, to everybody. Have a good night.